Encore une fois, une personne qui vient de loin, une personne qui va nous illuminer avec ses perspectives, cette fois-ci encore très différentes. Alors, c'est un plaisir d'introduire Hana Nagel qui vient de la côte ouest, vous l'avez lu, vous l'avez su, mais c'est une personne qui a voyagé à travers le monde, qui a une expérience humanitaire d'aide aux ONG, d'aide et d'implication dans la société de façon extraordinaire. On la retrouve maintenant chez Element AI à utiliser ce savoir de transformation de société pour voir comment l'intelligence artificielle peut guider dans la réflexion sur la transformation des comportements des usagers, des besoins. Merci, on l'applaudit bien fort. Hana Nagel, mesdames et messieurs.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for that warm introduction. I don't speak any French, so I don't know what you said, but I think it was nice. From the heart, okay. My name is Hannah. I'm a design researcher with Element AI, so we make AI-powered solutions for enterprises. And as you mentioned before that, I was working more in the sustainable development space. And so the talk that I want to bring to you today is kind of bringing those two concepts together. How can we think about social issues, social impact, when we're designing products that go out into the real world for businesses? And as a design researcher in the AI space, a lot of the work that I do is around trying to understand that kind of context. So understanding the different nuances and the variables that will impact the product, and then in turn, how that product will impact different contexts. And to try and work through some of this, I found a lot of inspiration in this quote from one of my favorite designers. His name is Eero Saarinen. He's a Finnish industrial designer and architect. And when he was designing things, he liked to say that you should always design a thing by considering it in its next larger context. A chair in a room in a house in an environment in a city plan. And the thing that I like so much about this quote is that it asks us to scope out this kind of context, to always be considering what it's nested in and how that's going to shape what we're putting out into the world. And I think this concept of considering context has a lot of urgency right now. I think as designers, and especially people who are making digital products, we've been moving fast and we've been breaking some things. And in order to understand how we can fix things and create things that have a positive social impact, we need to consider the different contexts that it's sitting in, and especially the socio-technical context that our products are part of. So the talk today is going to cover a lot of ground. We're going to be looking at a history of racist lending practices in the United States and how that's going to shape the future of AI-powered lending practices. We're also going to be looking at the relationship between cats and guacamole. We're going to look at what we can learn from the way that the set for Black Panther was designed, and how we can take all of those learnings to create a better future together. Now, I want to start with the smallest concept, so the chair in the room, so to speak. And I want us to examine how our mental models lead to the creation of the social systems in which we operate. And I'm going to start with a story that is not going to put me in the best light, but I want to be honest because I think that this is something that we all need to confront as we work towards this together. A couple years ago, I was trying to develop a workshop on user research, and the part of that workshop was about biases, and I was looking for an online test. I really like online quizzes, like BuzzFeed quizzes. And I found this quiz from Harvard University, from some researchers there, the Project Implicit Social Attitudes test. And I chose the race test. I thought I would take that quiz before I gave it in the workshop. And I chose the race quiz because I like to do well on quizzes, and I thought that I would have no bias on this quiz. I come from a really mixed race family. My mom is Austrian, her dad is from Trinidad, my dad's family is African American. So I was feeling very confident that I was going to get an A on this bias quiz, whatever that means. And it starts off fairly easy. It's supposed to test your immediate reactions to things. So it shows you photos of people, and you're asked to identify what race it is. Then it starts to show you words, and it asks you to identify whether that word has a positive or a negative impact. Then it starts to get a little tricky, and it starts to mix it together, race or positive or negative impact. I'm still feeling pretty good about it. So I click submit, and these Harvard researchers are telling me that I have a bias against Black people. And I'm like, this test is broken. Harvard is wrong. It happens. I do the whole test again, and it gives me the same output. And now I'm having like a full-blown identity crisis at my desk at work. Like, how could this be happening to me? Who even am I? And the reason that it happens is because I'm exposed, like we all are, to a range of different inputs. And those inputs help us to create schemas. And those schemas can be helpful or harmful, depending. And they can be helpful when they teach us how to react to different situations. So when we have new experiences, we can map old experiences onto it, and we know how to act. When we go to a professional situation, we know how to interact, even if it's a conference we've never been to before. But they can also be harmful if we don't unpack the ways in which those data inputs are skewed, are not accurately reflecting the world in which we live in. And some easy ways that we can look at that are the ways in which the media presents different things that help us to form different schemas. So one way that the media plays a role is by creating different associations between gender and certain professional roles like doctor. These are from the show ER. This can have harmful or dangerous impacts on our behavior when we learn perhaps not correct associations between things like ethnic background and aggression. There's been a lot of research around the ways in which the media portrays certain links and how that can cause us to have immediate reactions to situations that are not necessarily reflective of the world that we live in or the actual danger being presented to us. So what can we do when we want to unpack some of those schemas and take a closer look at the ways in which inputs are forming our own outputs? One thing that we can do for ourselves, which applies to AI models also, is to first recognize that the data that we're forming decisions based on is flawed. And once we realize that, we can create new data to balance that out. We can update the cast of our TV shows with a wide range of races and genders. And we can make new movies that portray folks of different ethnic backgrounds as brave or technologically advanced. But doing this kind of work requires bravery. It requires us to be introspective and to confront things about ourselves that may not necessarily be pleasant. And I want to encourage us to first look inwards, drawing from this analogy of a mirror from Emily Stiles, and to take a look at how our own inputs have shaped how we see the world, how our environment or different cues have created that view or that understanding, and then to unpack if that's something that we really want to be carrying forward. And then I want us to look outwards, to look out through the window, and to understand how our own biases are shaping the systems that we create, that we participate in, and how that in turn leads us to build these social and technical systems which may be biased by our own design. Now, to take a look at how some of those biases might play out on a social system role, I'm going to take a look at the United States, and we're going to look at how the history of racist lending practices started and how it is now feeding into automated lending practices. And while I'm going through this example, which is from the States, I also want us to take a look at how we've treated our own communities here in Canada, folks like the Indigenous community, which are still waiting on a lot of key services, which have now become entrenched in the ways in which we deliver those services. In 1934, the American government created an association called the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration. And the objective of this administration was to create a more balanced housing market after the Great Depression. And so they put together a bundle of money to give loans to different families so that they could buy homes. It's a fairly classic economic stimulus package. Now, in order to make it easy, they designed these color-coded maps. On its face, seems like a nice thing to do. And they color-coded it from green, which is automatically give a loan to the folks living in these neighborhoods. And then we had yellow and blue, and those were less desirable. And red meant automatically deny a loan to the folks living in these neighborhoods. They were deemed hazardous neighborhoods, anything coded in red. Now, what made a neighborhood hazardous? Was it proximity to water, flooding? What made a neighborhood dangerous was the ethnic background of the folks who lived there. So anything that surpassed a certain threshold of African Americans, Latinx folks, that was automatically redlined, coded in red, and folks there were denied the ability to get a loan to purchase a home. We can see how this played out by looking at this map from New York. And then we can see that large swaths of Brooklyn and Manhattan and Queens, those were all color-coded in red in 1934. Now, to understand how this becomes entrenched in our technical systems, we can fast forward about 80 years and take a look at what happened when Amazon rolled out Amazon Prime same-day delivery in 16 major cities across the United States. The overlap of zip codes, which were excluded from delivery, line up almost exactly with the 1934 redlining. And the reason that this happened is because they drew from that same database, the US Census Bureau as well. So it becomes coded into the ways in which we design our systems, social and technical, and then feeding into AI as well, because we're not asking questions about how that context came to be. We're saying that that limited set of data is an accurate reflection of the world, and then we should base all our decisions around it. And when they asked Amazon about the racist impact of this the delivery decision, they said that they had no discriminatory intent. They didn't mean for this to happen. But our ethics only extend as far as our line of inquiry. We can only maintain our ability to act in ethical and responsible ways when we're asking deep and sometimes uncomfortable questions about the context in which we operate. So we really need to be investigating how that data came to be and whether it's the data that we should be basing our decisions on. This data exists in context, but technical systems can't read that context. It's just a data point. But this singular data point exists in a whole history of racist lending practices, and that exists in schemas about race and class, which have been going on in our society for a long time. And so we need to continually be viewing that data within that context in order to reach that outcome that we desire. Now, I've been talking about bias and this kind of bias is unexamined prejudices, and I want to take a look at how bias works in AI models in order to understand how we can kind of balance that out. So an AI application uses machine learning models that train on data, and a bias in AI models stems from erroneous assumptions in the learning algorithm. That's just a fancy way to say that when the model is biased, it's making connections between data points that it shouldn't be making. Now, to understand how this plays out in different models, we can take a look at neural classifier models. This is a kind of model that's used to identify images. So some researchers at Stanford University were training a neural network classifier, and they showed it this picture of a cat. And the model was sure with about 85% certainty that it was indeed looking at a tabby cat. Now, when they slightly modified that image, modified a couple pixels, suddenly the model was sure with 99.9% certainty that it was looking at guacamole. Now, the model couldn't explain why it was suddenly guacamole. It doesn't have any context. It only looks at data, and it looks at that data outside of context, and sometimes it reaches erroneous assumptions like we do. Models can fall prey to interpreting data in the wrong way, just like humans, but we can't give the models any more context unless we understand that context. It only knows what we can reflect to it. Now, to understand the different ways in which models can interpret data and maybe fall prey to some biases, we can look at what's called the bias-variance trade-off. So these models can fall on this spectrum. On one side, we have models that display high bias, or high statistical bias to be exact, and they have what's called high human priors. So that means that there are explicit human beliefs about the world that are coded into these models. So we tell it what the world is like in order for it to make decisions. Now, this makes them easy to understand because we've told the model exactly how the world works. So this is a kind of simplified model of a lending practice. So on one side, we've told the model that if an applicant has low assets, then they're a bad risk. And on the other side, if the applicant has an income greater than $30,000, that they're a good risk. So the two things that I want us to draw out from here are A, the explicitness of those human beliefs that are literally coded in, and also that it's only looking at variables that we've told it to look at. We told it to look at assets and income. We didn't tell it to look at things like gender or race, their immigration history. It's only looking at what we told it is important. Now, on the other side, we have a kind of model called the high variance model. Now, this model has low human priors or low human beliefs in the system, and it instead learns connections between different variables based on the data that we give it. And a simplified kind of visual here is we see an input layer where we've given it certain data, and then there's this literally hidden layer where it starts to sift through all of that data and it tries to understand connections that we have not necessarily given it. Now, this can be problematic when the data is biased, and the data is almost always biased because we make the data and we are biased. So an example of this is, again, from Amazon. A couple years ago, they created what was a high variance model, and it was intended to assess applicants for their engineering department. Now, their engineering department is overwhelmingly male, it's overwhelmingly white. So when they gave it that data set and they asked it to go through applications, it started to make certain causal links between female names, female schools, certain after-school activities that might be more predominantly female, like ballet, and it started to exclude those applications. It said those will not be a good fit, they're going to be bad engineers. So again, the model itself is not biased, but the people who are making decisions that generates that data are reflecting certain biases, and the model picks up on those. Now, this may be what you want. You may be wanting to build a certain department that looks a certain way. But if you're not, and you're not understanding the ways in which your system works, you're going to end up with impacts or decisions that are not necessarily what you're aiming for. So what we do want to do instead, both for ourselves and for the systems that we create, is to take this structural causal model, or causal discovery approach, where we try and understand the different variables in our system and how they're actually linked in order to reach the outcomes that we want to see. And the structural causal approach has deep roots in fields like psychology, which has taken a look at the connections between the causal connections between things like media inputs and schemas. And it also has some deep history in fields like economics, which looks at the causal links between your zip code or your postal code and predictors of individual wealth. So when we apply this to the field of computer science, we can take a couple approaches. One would be this prediction approach, which says, given this person's data and past decisions taken about that data, would this person be accepted? Or an intervention approach, would someone be more likely to be accepted if the judges couldn't tell their gender? Or a counterfactual approach, would the specific person be more likely to be accepted if the judges could not tell their gender? So I want to take a look at how this plays out in this real-life situation of the Boston Orchestra. So the Boston Orchestra in 1952, overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly white. And the reasons for this kind of makeup given were that men were simply better at playing instruments than women, an argument which has a lot of similarities when people ask why there are more engineers who are men and white. And that may be true, but it's worth investigating. And so they took a causal discovery approach, and they found out that, in fact, women were just as good at playing instruments, and the decisions being rendered by the judges were actually due to bias. So what the question the judges were trying to answer when people would come and apply to play in this orchestra was, should this applicant be accepted? And this is the kind of model that they thought they were playing. This is a very high-level version of what this AI model might look like as well. So what they wanted to have was you hear the applicant play, then you assess their musicianship, how good they are at playing it, and then you render a decision, yes or no. But there's a lot of environmental context around this. People walk out on stage and their shoes make a certain sound, and then you see that person and you can make some judgments about them, and then they start to play. And so the model, in fact, looked closer to this. Hear the shoe clack on stage, identify gender, trigger certain biases, and that happens alongside this other flow. And in order to kind of suss out these different variables, they took a two-pronged approach. At first, they put a screen up on stage so that you couldn't see the person walking onto the stage. But because you could still hear that clack of the shoes on the stage, and that time women mostly wore high heels, and that had a very distinct sound on the stage, people were still able to identify whether it was a woman or a man. And so that gender bias was still being triggered. And so what they had to do was do that double-blind approach, where they put a carpet on the stage to mask the sound, and they put the blind on the stage to mask the visuals. And this is how we ended up with the decision path they actually wanted, which was hear the quality of their musicianship and then assess. And what I want us to take away from this as well is that If we had given this to a model, it probably would have came to the same biased decision, because what the model is doing is trying to answer the question, what would a human do in this situation? Given this data and given this context, what decision would a human render? It cannot answer the should question. What should we do? What is the ethical thing to do or the best thing to do? And what we need to do in order to enable these new systems is to uncover the biases that might be blocking our own decision paths. And in this way, we can design systems that are reflective of the world we want to live in and less reflective of the biases in the current world that we live in. So what's the role of a designer in all of this? How can we start to mitigate bias through design? One thing I think we need to do is to think really deeply about the world that we want to create, to be taking a look at the chair, the room, the environment, the city plan, and really mapping out all of that context in order to understand what we want to change. We also need a wide range of intersectional expertise in order to identify the things that we do not know. We're all bringing a certain set of knowledge, some helpful biases, some unhelpful biases to the table. And in order to put all that together and see the world as it really is, we need a wide range of backgrounds to kind of fill in those blanks. And in this way, we can co-design a resilient socio-technical system together. So to close, I want to go back to one of my obviously favorite movies, Black Panther. And I want to take a look at the approach that Hannah Beachler took. She was a set designer for Black Panther, and she was tasked with this really monumental task of bringing this movie to life. And in order to get started with that, she took 10 months to create a 500-page document that she called the Bible of Wakanda. And she traveled around Africa to several different countries. And she asked what I think is a really important question for all of us to be asking as we design these new systems. She asked, what is here? And was it always here? And why? To try to get to the bottom of how can we change the world that we live in order to create a new world that puts people before technology. And she built a really intentional team, a wide range of ethnic backgrounds, genders, folks all along the spectrum of sexuality, because she knew that she was tasked with building that new world, and that this would be an example to a lot of different folks who would look to that process. And she said, I'm hoping the kids are looking and saying, we can get more done together. And I think we can too. If you're interested in some of the resources that I touched on really lightly in the talk today, you can go to this Google folder. It's going to have a link to a book on causal discovery process, some articles that touch on the FHA, and a recipe for guacamole. Thank you.
Bravo, Hana. Bravo. It's fascinating, fascinating.
I'm going to get water while we
Please do, please do. Là, chers amis, sli.do, je veux recevoir vos questions. On a des gens extraordinaires, on va en profiter. And Hana, what we see here is a completely different perspective, as what you're proposing is, in terms of designers of experience, not only design for what we know are actual cognitive biases, actual preferences, or known behavior to which we will cater with a design of a user experience, but aren't you proposing to also design for the kind of society and behavior you actually want to create and live up to?
Yes, I think that as things become ever more interconnected, that part of our role is to ensure that we have the kind of impact we design for today, but also tomorrow and the next year. And I know this is a very big task. We can only scope out so much. But I think that if we look back on a history of kind of product design or digital design, so let's say 10 or 20 years, we weren't really tasked with asking that question because things weren't moving that quickly. But now we've seen that things can swing very quickly in positive or negative directions. And it's up to us, since we're kind of these gatekeepers of impact, to at least start to ask those questions. Even if we know that we're making mistakes, even if we know that we're missing some points, making that first step to say, we understand that there are separate contexts that are kind of overlapping, and we need to be thinking about the kind of systemic connections between them is really important.
So, therefore, as a designer, therefore, you must refer to a direction in terms of where you want the user experience to lead the users. Where will that direction come from?
Oh, that's a good question. In a lot of the product teams that I've been with, there's always a point where you kind of sit with the product owner or the product manager, and you determine what kind of value or impact you want that product to have. And we sometimes make that in isolation. So we have some user research or we have some sort of market insights, but we're looking at it maybe just on that one particular site or in this one particular business. But we're not necessarily looking at how does this integrate with Facebook marketing, for example? What happens when this rolls out to communities that don't necessarily have stable Wi-Fi access? And in order to be asking those kinds of questions, we need to bring a lot of different folks into the table to try and turn some of those unknowns, so things we didn't even think about, into at least mapping out areas that now we know exist. And then we can start to think about narrowing down or kind of refining the kind of impact that it has.
You exposed how AI algorithms are following biases based on what was fed to them. But the question from the audience is how to make sure we remove biases from AI models.
Oh, so if I had the answer to that question, I would also have a lot of money. I think that the first step is taking a look at what's included or excluded from that data set. So when we're trying to understand how we came to get the data that we have, and then thinking about what biases might have been present in kind of shaping or skewing that data set. And then once you have that, there are a couple different technical approaches that you can use. The easiest simply being making more data, others being kind of like cleaning up the data. I think that would be like a whole other talk. I would say there's some technical approaches and some social approaches that we could use to identify why the data set is limited. Can we fix the data set? Or if we're constrained to that current data set, then what's a technical approach that we could use?
It relates to another question we have here, which is, are all bias bad biases? And therefore, could you sometimes want to kind of bend the bias the other way and actually have a positive bias for some reason? So are all biases bad biases?
Sure, so that's a really good question. And I'm going to reframe that question if that's okay. I think that biases can have positive or negative impacts. So one bias that we might have is, like a really simple one, is that like fire is bad. So we have a bias away from heat. We don't want to get too close to it. That has a positive impact in like preserving our physical safety. Do we want to have that same kind of bias towards folks of different ethnic backgrounds? No, probably, I would say. We want to be taking closer looks at what the impact of that bias is. And if that bias is even taking us in the direction that we want to go to, so like the Boston Orchestra example, where they had a bias against women, and that was actually detrimental to their goal of building the best orchestra in the world. I think the Boston Orchestra is the 4th best in America. And if that is your goal, to have the best orchestra, then you don't want to have a bias against women. If your goal is to have an all-male orchestra, then you do. For example, there are all-women universities in the United States, and those application processes have a bias against men because the goal is to exclude men from that process. So it's taking a look at what your goal actually is, and then are your biases moving you closer towards that goal? Are they creating the impact that you want it to have? Or are they actually taking you further away from your goal or causing a negative impact?
I have a question that's absolutely not related to what you're asking you guys. I'm sorry, but you know, when I was thinking of AI in a UX conference, I was thinking, hey, would it be possible that in the future we actually have to create new user experiences or new user interfaces with intelligent machines? Is that an emerging science and profession?
A new user interface?
With machines that have the new abilities coming from AI?
That is another hard question. I think that...
Hey, Google.
Well, Google's tricky with this one also. I think that it can be nice to think that machines will fix the thing, whatever the thing is, but machines are only doing what we tell it to. And we have fixed some things, we've broken a lot of other things. So before we move really quickly and we say the model is going to do a better job, we need to take a look at why we are not doing a good job, and then how is the model going to be empowered to do that differently. So this is not exactly the interface design question, but if we're looking at things like AI in healthcare, which is generating some very questionable decisions, and by questionable I mean very bad, and there's been some feedback around it that it's not doing a good job, and the people who are designing the model are saying, well, it's doing exactly what the doctor would do. But that's not what we want it to do. If the doctors are replicating biases against women, against people of color, against trans folks, against Indigenous folks, and these are all problems that we do see in our Canadian healthcare system, we don't want to slap a model on top of that and say, here, you do it. That means that we no longer have ethical responsibility. We've kind of outsourced that to this, math magic. But that's not going to make things better. It's going to break certain things. And once we break that kind of thing and it becomes entrenched in other systems, we build a social system, a technical system on top of that, an AI model on top of that, now I'm going off on a rant, that kind of responsibility gets dispersed throughout. And then it's hard to say who really broke the thing, who's responsible for making it better. So before we do any of that, before we move that fast, I always want to bring it back to us and just ask that question of why aren't we doing this right? And therefore, how can we make a system that might improve it?
You alluded to physicians.
Yes.
That's actually one of my pet topic, the field of healthcare. And in the field of healthcare, the question is there when you have physicians that are experts with the advent of AI, they get to wonder, will intelligent machines replace our clinical judgment? And what we see is rather a combination where AI algorithms help enhance the physician's decision in providing them more insights into a situation, more perspective from the best practices out there that the physician might not have had the ability to absorb. In the field of UX and UI designs, could we imagine a future where AI engines help UX designers be better designers by better harnessing all of those principles that all of those experts are trying to teach us, but bringing them to the UX designer when they need it?
Yeah, I think that we could. I think that this kind of structural causal model approach, it's not fully there right now. It's not doing all the things that we would dream that it would do from a model approach, but it is improving all the time. And I can foresee a time in the close future where it would work alongside humans to point out their biases, because it does have that ability to surface correlations or connections between variables that we are not necessarily able to observe. And if we could kind of work alongside the model in this way for it to point out flaws in our decision-making process or flaws in our understanding of systems, I can certainly see how that would lead to a better user experience or service design.
Big round of applause for Hana Nagel, mesdames et messieurs. On l'applaudit bien fort. Merci beaucoup. Bravo.